Joshua, let's talk about this very odd article. I mean, I want to see if we can kind of bring a little bit more meat to it. But it's kind of interesting, and maybe, David, you could share this. Pentagon war game includes scenario for military response to domestic Gen Z rebellion. This was written in June 5th, 2020 by Nick Turse in The Intercept. Could you scroll down a bit, David? Documents obtained by The Intercept via the Freedom of Information Act revealed that a Pentagon war game called 2018 Joint Land, Air, and Sea Strategic Special Program, or JLAS, offered a scenario in which members of Generation Z were driven by malaise and discontent to launch something called Zbellion in America in the mid-2020s. The Zbellion plot was a small part of the JLAS 2018, which also featured scenarios involving Islamist militants in Africa, anti-capitalist extremists, which I'd like to hear more about, and ISIS successors. The war game was conducted by students and faculty from the U.S. military's War College. And then it goes on. I'll stop in a second, but this is interesting. According to the scenario, many members of Gen Z are psychologically scarred in their youth by 9/11 and the Great Recession. Check, check. Crushed by college debt. Check. Disenchanted with their employment options. Check. Have given up their hopes for a good life and believe the system is rigged against them. Check, check. And then it goes on to explain how the origins of the uprising, here's how the origins of the uprising are described. I'll quote one and then I'll stop. Gen Z, I'm taking to the middle of it, are often described as seeking independence and opportunity, but also among the least likely to believe that there is such a thing as the American dream and that the system is quote unquote rigged against them. Frequently seeing themselves as agents for social change, they crave fulfillment and excitement in their job to help, quote, move the world forward, unquote. Despite the technological proficiency they possess, Gen Z actually prefer person-to-person contact as opposed to online interaction. They describe themselves being involved in virtual and physical communities and have rejected excessive consumerism. So I think one of the things I find interesting about this is I think partially, and I have no idea who generates these scenarios, but I think partially because of the class composition of the U.S. military, there's probably a lot more in touchness with the reality of economic and social trends for younger people. Because I could just say, I could not imagine, not to this degree, but I don't know if there's this kind of thinking going on, at least even in 2018, other kind of elite parts of the American system. I mean, obviously a lot of things have changed in people's calculus in the last 3 or 4 weeks, but this is in 2018.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, the Pentagon also had the most sober analysis of climate change of, various elite wings of our whole government apparatus.
Right.
I love the name Zbellion is hilarious. It's like a Michael Albert project of like Z Magazine and Z Media, Z Communications, Zbellion.
Zbellion.
Yeah. Both the psychological and tactical preparation for domestic military repression is not new. And I want to share a really similar war game that they did about 15 years ago in a minute. But it was interesting to me, so this part of the hook for this article was right after Trump was trying to bring in the military for this set of uprisings. Right. And Mark, the defense secretary, Mark Esper, had that phrase, dominate the battle space, which is how they think about this. And it strikes me that I just want to reframe what you the check marks you gave earlier, which shows they really do understand organizing. So they stated, number one, the material conditions that give rise to it, where they talked about job prospects and debt. And then number two, they describe the breaking apart of American hegemony that holds together, fancies of the American dream and the rigged system. And then number 3, when they said, was the quote, frequently seeing themselves as agents of social change, craving fulfillment and excitement in their job to help move the world forward. That's making meaning and purpose. So those are the 3 pillars of how I understand social movements: is the material conditions that give rise to them, dismantling the hegemonic cultural order that keeps things in place, and then movements giving people a sense of purpose in an alienated society that's divorced from spirit. And that was all in the first paragraph description. So it's smart. It's smart. I also love the part of it where they were talking about Gen Z using like cyber nonviolent direct action tactics for wealth redistribution, and like Robin Hooding corporations and stuff.
Do you want to read that part of it if you have it in front of you? That was the most interesting part.
I don't have it in front of me.
You have it? I want to read that part. That part was definitely the most like, okay.
During face-to-face recruitment, would-be members of Zbellion are given instructions for going to sites on the dark web that allow them to access sophisticated malware to siphon funds from corporations, financial institutions, and nonprofits that support the establishment. Let's fast forward a little bit. Zbellion leadership says the scenario assures its members that their Robin Hood-esque wealth redistribution is not only untraceable by law enforcement, but ultimately justifiable as targets are selected based on secure polling of network delegates. Although its origins are Americans, by the latter 2020s, Zbellion activities are going on across Europe, cities across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East.
So a couple of things that I find interesting. I mean, first of all, just the idea of them using malware to like directly redistribute wealth online is, I mean, it's basically utopian. This is the military, like, it's like almost like a digital version of something as inspiring as like the landless workers movement or something. The other things though that I find interesting are like, one, and we're going to talk about this later when I address this right-wing, left-wing populism thing. It is incredible how thorough America is immersed in substitute language for capital. It's always like this, because even in this scenario, they're describing a dissatisfaction with capital. They're talking about redistributing wealth. They're talking about, job prospects. So it isn't just like a general, like, these are a bunch of nihilists or nihilists and they just want to like do shit. They're talking about a specific set of grievances, but they still are conceiving it as like the establishment, right? Mm-hmm. Then I think it's interesting, and I think it's actually problematic. I've talked about Alex Huckley has a really good piece in Damage Mag where he critiques a certain manifestation of the globalization of these movements as kind of like an export of American soft power. And, what William Shockey was saying last week, which I really appreciated, was like, if this was a genuinely global movement, the lessons from South Africa would be migrating to the United States, just as this tactics and inspiration in the United States would be migrating to South Africa. And again, I always want to say, that's always where I'm coming from, right? When I critique these things, it's ironically, when I'm being deeply non-woke, it's usually because I want a way more global demand. And then, but it's interesting that they just conceive of like, well, of course it's going to start in the States and spread out. There's still that like default assumption of our soft power. Those were the sort of main things that caught me. We're like, we're talking about capital, but we're still never going to use this word, even when we're trying to like understand an enemy, because it really is that they are the enemy in this war game scenario. And also that, the redistribution through Bitcoin that's certainly the most exciting use of Bitcoin technology I've ever heard of. And the third, this idea of movements as American soft power, not genuinely globally integrated movements, which I think is real and is a big problem.
I think it's a fun scenario too, just because in the same way that they pinpoint exactly what so many of the social economic issues that that Gen Z is experiencing, They also like highlight what their political role is in society, right? Which is the defense and the maintenance of the powerful to prevent the many from basically using that power of being the many to start to take wealth back for themselves and redistribute amongst the people. The military understands that their role is absolutely to prevent that from ever happening in this country.
Yeah, yeah. There's actually a lot of scenarios where they map out grassroots movements and position it as an existential threat. We have in the Wildfire Project, when we do strategy with groups, we do an exercise where we have them strategize as if they are the opposition. And in doing that over the years, it got me down this rabbit hole of reading RAND reports. And RAND is the corporate think tank that generates scenarios for the Pentagon. And in 2005, so this is a full 15 years ago, they mapped out their first set of scenarios for the 21st century. And it's called Alternative Futures and Their Implications for Army Modernization. And that is an international orientation. And it's basically the main enemy is they located in the environmental movement. They said that it's going to emerge as in 80 different countries, a network called the World Environmental League is going to be basically spearheading grassroots uprisings. And I wanted to share it actually. Can I read a quote from it? Because it's pretty amazing. So this was what and what we're talking about now, the Gen Z thing, that was just a war game. It said this is not a projection. This is their actual, like one of their projections of one of the likely futures that they saw at least 15 years ago. And they wrote, in this hypothetical future, the period from 2020 to 2025 witnesses a dramatic growth in the threats to the United States presented by radical transnational peace and justice social groups, using the goal of creating a global civil society as their rallying cry. Large militant transnational actors appear promoting radical agendas for the environment, nuclear disarmament, and third world land reform. And it goes on. And basically, like one of the assumptions here is that the nation state withers as like a central organizing force. And it maps out 4 scenarios. The best case scenario is US unipolarity. Their medium good cases are the rise of one major competitor and competitive multipolarity. Their almost worst case scenario that they're most preparing for is this one, what they call the transnational web, which was basically like how they're going to fight civil society groups. And then their worst one was they called chaos anarchy. But it was part of a long trajectory of them preparing to view domestic, like orient the military towards domestic repression. This one happened to be international in scope.
You just watched a Michael Brooks show video. Subscribe to get them all. Why wouldn't you? Don't be foolish. Click subscribe below and become a patron as well. Patreon.com/TMBS. Thanks, everybody.